I call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, you hear all sorts of things in these chambers, don't you? I mean, just yesterday a Labor Party, or what is left of the great Labor Party, trying to erode human rights in our immigration policy. Today we have a Labor member lauding the Maths and Science Olympiad the day after they double the help fees for people who choose to study science and maths. And so I say, Deputy Speaker, they will be saying thank you, Member for Bruce, for the adjournment speech, but why are you doubling my help fees? They'll be saying, why are you hitting us with a carbon tax? And when you send us overseas to Estonia to go and be engaged in the wonderful pursuits of maths and science, where they only pay $1 per person per year for a carbon tax, when they get home, they'll say thank you for the adjournment speech, but they'll say, when are you getting rid of the carbon tax? Let me remind Deputy Speaker that after the next election, when this tax is repealed, we will see where members on the other side sit when we need to make that decision. Will they quiver and shrivel with what is left of the Greens, or will they come across and vote with the new government and say that this tax was one big fat mistake? Let's go straight to the electorate of Bowman, where I have the largest offshore population in Australia in my electorate, nearly 5,000 people, many of whom commute every day of the working week through the year to jobs on the mainland. They make 600,000 trips, Deputy Speaker, on a water taxi. And of course the Prime Minister, exempting road travel and the fuel costs associated, obviously forgot water-based travel. Now, these Australians are no less Australians. They are Stradbroke Islanders, they are Southern Moreton Bay Islanders, but they pay a carbon tax, Deputy Speaker, on the ferry journeys that they take over 500,000 times a year, adding 6 cents a litre onto the diesel that's used there, 3 million litres of diesel per year. This is yet another prism through which we can look at the impact of the carbon tax, for which these islanders will not be compensated. Now, just tell me for a moment how the Treasury modelling accounted for Australians living on offshore islands who need to make ferry journeys to the mainland for work. Precisely where in the modelling, show me the line, will they be compensated specifically over and above for the transport costs that they face? These are not wealthy Australians. They live in a household of average $260,000 household, compared with $400,000 on the mainland. They are lower income earners. There are more seniors who are in the workforce. There are more people with slightly larger families than on the mainland. And most importantly of all, a large number of people who are trying to find work moving off the islands to do so, where of course the only hope of a lot of employment exists. Deputy Speaker, there is no provision for these forgotten people. In Menzies' words, these are people who have been forgotten by the carbon tax. Now, just don't think that you're hit by the carbon tax when you're at work or going to the shopping centre. Let's also remember the very important work done by the New South Wales and Victorian governments on the impact of the carbon tax on hospital beds, no less. And we've got the New South Wales government, and don't say they can't add up just because they had a Labor government that preceded them that racked up a debt. This is a coalition government that commissioned independent research to look at the costs on their hospital system. Now, this is a state facing a $26 million carbon tax bill for their 13,496 beds, and when you do the math, it's a $2,000 bill per year, per bed in the health system. Extrapolated to Queensland, where the power prices are only slightly less, thanks to the Bligh government that preceded the one we have now, we are looking at my 174-bed Redland-based hospital paying, hang on, wait for it, more than $250,000 a year in carbon tax, for goodness sake. My local hospital that cares for the ill and the most vulnerable, where does that money come from? Just explain to me where in the wonderful carbon tax churn go round is there some form of compensation for my hospital that is paying this ridiculous fee and has no means of recouping it. Does the Labor government propose that we have a boom gate and charge for parking? I mean, does the Labor government suggest that we reduce some services or have no more outreach to the community? No, they don't. There's money going into this, money going into that, but nothing to help us run the hospital or to compensate for those costs. Now, this is just another example. Wherever you go, from June 1, you will find a coalition member of parliament fighting against this evil and insidious tax. This is not a tax that bears any resemblance to predecessors in other countries. This is not a tax that has caused any other nations to follow in our path. This is simply a post-election conception by a Prime Minister who had all the choice in the world whether or not to introduce a carbon tax. What she said before the election is what she wanted to do after. And she was not in any way compelled to do this by the Greens. She could have raised her hands and said, you know what, I made a promise to the people. But that is something she never did. She turned to the Greens and said, now we're in, let's change it all, let's get on with what we really want to do. And that's why, at that moment, wherever you go, Australians will tell you At that moment, she wrote her political obituary.